about this or just politically posturing?
We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister, ministerial code permitted, of course, what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Well, I'll be in this chamber to hear the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth deliver a budget for economic growth and job creation over Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
Well, of course, the First Minister said that last time, and the evidence in his budget proved that wasn't the case. We do know, of course, that after this afternoon we are going to hear John Swinney's budget. Last year, he presented a budget which outlined engineering giant Doosan's investment in Scotland, but by the time we voted on the budget, John Swinney and the First Minister both knew that the company had changed its plans. When did the First Minister find out about Doosan's decision, and why did he not tell Parliament?
First Minister.
The request by Doosan that they wanted to keep their plans commercial had to be respected by the Scottish Government. And if Joanne Lamont is seriously saying that she wouldn't request such a request, she wouldn't respect such a request from companies, then I rather think she is a long, long way from political office. I know that Joanne Lamont will want to acknowledge the outstanding success of Scottish Development International, which this year once again have demonstrated the top performance for inward investment across these islands. Indeed, the latest Ernst & Young survey demonstrates that Scotland beat even London in terms of inward investment. I think that sort of effort from our agencies should be congratulated, not demeaned.
Joanne Lamont.
And that is very interesting, but it's not the answer to the question you were asked. So nothing new there. The reality is that the First Minister knows when he was told and knows that it was wrong not to tell the Parliament about Doosan's cancellation. But he just doesn't want us to know the truth. That's why he has refused to answer any Freedom of Information request on this issue. And the refusal to answer questions isn't just the First Minister's style. Every Thursday at First Minister's question time in this chamber is increasingly the style of his whole government. That is why the number of appeals against ministers refusing to release information has risen by 175% in the last year. Why is that? Is the First Minister getting even more secretive, or does he have even more to hide?
First Minister.
Well,
Order. First Minister.
I got here the Scottish Government's performance under Freedom of Information since we took office, and Joanne Lamont won't mind if I compare it to 2005. The performance in terms of being on time with the responses, that's gone up from 75% to 82%, which I think is a pretty good performance. In terms of releasing information, which was the real concern of Joanne Lamont, it's gone up from 69% to 71%. That is a rise from the secretive days of the Labour Liberal administration in Scotland. And in terms of appeals, what has been judged in favour of the SNP government compared to Labour government has gone up from 68 to 72% judgments in favour. So on all these criteria, this government is performing better under freedom of information than the government of which Joanne Lamont was proud to serve, but refused to tell the people a whole range of important areas of information.
Mr McNeill, I'd appreciate if you'd stop shouting across the chamber. Joanne Lamont.
Well, all of that is very interesting. However, what the First Minister
Order.
is always interesting and creative and enthusiastic till you go back and look at the figures later. However, what the First Minister has to explain is why Rosemary Agnew, who's the Information Commissioner, says we are in a worse position in relation to rights to information than we were when the Freedom of Information Act was passed. That is not me saying it. That's the Information Commissioner saying it, and I suspect I would trust her figures before those of the First Minister himself. But of course, this is a First Minister who can't be straight with or have respect for the Scottish people. He refuses to tell us what advice he has on an independent Scotland's place in Europe. Incredibly, he is even today taking the Freedom of Information Commissioner to the Court of Session to try to shut her up, just like when he spent hundreds of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' cash, our cash, against official advice to stop the public knowing the truth about his tax plans. So in a time when families across the country are paying the price for his budget cuts, why is he spending hundreds of thousands of pounds of Scottish people's money to stop the people of Scotland finding out what he's doing?
First Minister.
Why
Order.
Every week expecting Joanne Lamont to ask about the economy and poverty, and she never asks about any of these matters in the First Minister's questions. But can I have the protect the Freedom of Information Commissioner from the partial quoting of Joanne Lamont? What she actually said was that she was worried about a deteriorating position because of the propensity of local authorities in Scotland to set up arm's-length bodies. Which council in Scotland has set up more arm's-length bodies than any other if it wasn't for Glasgow? And incidentally, once we get the present Freedom of Information legislation through this Parliament to make it more robust in this term, I'm extremely sympathetic to the Freedom of Information Commissioner's request to extend it to arm's-length bodies set up by local authorities. Now, Joanne Lamont tells us, and I should correct her, the Freedom of Information Commissioner has gone looking for an urgent disposal of the case. We agree with her. We think there should be an urgent disposal of the case today, not vice versa. And Joanne Lamont also wanted to know why there might be more appeals under Freedom of Information. It might be there are more requests under Freedom of Information. And I've been doing a bit of research, and I find that one person, a Labour researcher, is responsible for over 14% of all the Freedom of Information requests. Now, unfortunately, I can't tell you who this person is because he's asked to remain anonymous. Such is the Labour Party's commitment to freedom of information.
Can I advise the First Minister not to judge his success in that answer by the cheering from his backbenchers? He might want to get out a bit more, head for George Square and ask them what they think of that as an answer to his question. Because, of course, the First Minister could solve the problem this morning in the court, which he says they agree, we want to speed it up. All he needs to do is ask his law officers permission to give the information to the people of Scotland, and then they wouldn't need to be in court at all. Now, it is no wonder that the Freedom of Information Commissioner said this week it's simply not acceptable that citizens' rights continue to be eroded. The fact of the matter is, the First Minister says spending in colleges has gone up when he has cut it. Audit Scotland is investigating the NHS because they don't believe his figures, and he uses taxpayers' money to go to court to stop the public knowing the truth, not just about Europe, but about anything he finds an inconvenient truth. The First Minister wishes I would ask him the right question. The people of this country would wish that he would start answering questions. And we have to ask him this question that people across this country are asking. Why can't this First Minister be straight with the Scottish people?
First Minister.
As far as the specifics of the European question and legal advice, I believe that the statement made last week, pointing out that the White Paper will be informed by the legal advice at that time offers the solution both of providing the information to the Scottish people and keeping me in terms of compliance with the Ministerial Code. I know that Joanne Lamont would be thinking it a tragedy if I broke the Ministerial Code, and she wouldn't really want that to happen. Now, I wasn't judging the success of the last answer on the basis of the cheering of the back benches. I was judging it on Joanne Lamont's countenance, which I have to say was extremely worrying to me. I mean, if I'm not very careful, I'll end up on leave with Rama Akasha or swimming with the fishes for Colin Smith. I mean, if people get removed for insubordination within the Labour Party, goodness knows what would happen if Labour ever had inflicted on the people of Scotland the misfortune to be back in government.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson. Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
The Deputy First Minister and I had a productive meeting with the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State only yesterday, and the Deputy First Minister will meet the Secretary of State again next week.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, frankly, I find it extraordinary that a political party attempting to get information out of the government of the day, worthy of roars of laughter, of derision from that government, absolutely extraordinary, when this is a government which has been trying to block information being passed to the public. I also find it extraordinary, Presiding Officer,
Order.
that this First Minister would like to compare this year with 2005, because from the figures I have in front of me, I don't know if he's talking about 2004-05 or 2005-06, but together the number of appeals blocked by this government, by the government then, was 166, compared to the last 2 years, which goes up to 215. If we look at this case today, that has cost us a six-figure sum, a cost continuing to rise, and that's before we've had 2 days scheduled in the Court of Session. Before the election last year, the First Minister spent over £100,000 of taxpayers' money to keep from voters his plans for a local income tax. So I asked the First Minister, how much of the taxpayers' hard-earned money is he and his ministerial team spending to shore up his secret to society and to deny information to which the people of Scotland are perfectly entitled?
First Minister.
Can I just point out it's the Information Commissioner who's going to court today by agreement with the Scottish Government because she wants an urgent disposal of the public interest element and freedom of information request. Can I also point out that the Scottish Government is a minority of the number of public interest questions to be settled in freedom of information. Now, Ruth Davidson asks about the figures I have. They are annual year figures. The point I was making is in terms of information release, that is the amount of information given out to the public, that is 71%, which is a rise. In terms of the responses on time, and incidentally, many appeals take place because of lack of timely response, then that's risen from 75% to 82%. And then on the adjudication of the appeals, there is also a rising trend in favour of the Scottish Government's interpretation of the Act. But, let me say, I welcome the Conservative Party's newfound conversion to the question of freedom of information. As I recall, and perhaps I'm open to correction from the new direction of the Conservative Party led by Ruth Davidson, the Conservative Party were the least party in favour of freedom of information, and the people who are most suspicious about giving any information out at all. So I know that she really does welcome, despite the Better Together campaign and the alliance of the Labour Party and the Conservative, that she does welcome the fact that on every criteria the performance of the SNP government in freedom of information exceeds that of the Labour Liberal administration that went before us.
Ruth Davidson. Order.
Of course, despite all of that, I'd asked about costs, but I guess you're keeping that a secret too, eh? We know about the two We know about the two cases that have cost over £100,000 each. But what this government hasn't told us is that there are 500 more appeals since this First Minister came to power. This First Minister is so paranoid that even the smallest details are being blocked, like requests asking who he'd been to the theatre with. So if this First Minister is so open, as he's saying that he is, and he appears not to be...
Order, settle down.
At the risk of sparking yet another costly legal action against the interests of the people of Scotland. Can this First Minister tell us, for instance, what legal advice he's received about an independent Scotland leaving NATO?
First Minister.
The position on appeals, if you take 2006, 8% of cases went to appeal. In 2011, it was 6% of cases. Ruth Davis will have to take on board the point I was making about the increased volume of numbers of requests. And I'm sure that no Conservative researcher is responsible for 14% in themselves of the number of FOI requests coming forward. In terms of being to the theatre, I confirm that I have not been to the theatre with any member of the Conservative Party parliamentary group, and I have no intention of doing so. With that reassurance, I can put Ruth Davidson's mind at rest.
Constituency question, Liam MacArthur.
Obviously, the First Minister will be aware of SSE's decision last week to close the grid in Orkney to connections and effective moratorium that risks a loss of revenue and jobs to the islands, as well as posing a threat to the investor confidence in Orkney's hard-won reputation as a hub for renewables. I'm very grateful to Fergus Ewing for his positive engagement with me and local stakeholders in seeking to identify technical, regulatory and other solutions, but it will take time for those solutions to be put in place. Can I therefore ask the First Minister to make urgent representations to Ian Marchant at SSE to ensure everything possible is done to accelerate this process, alongside any steps that might be taken more immediately? And in particular, will he support an urgent review of proposals put forward by Orkney Islands Council that could facilitate a switch away from fossil fuels, increase electricity demand and thereby help alleviate the current grid constraints?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Liam MacArthur for raising the issue? I mean, Orkney has massive renewables potential, and I know that Scottish Cabinet colleagues were impressed with the work that's been done there when the Cabinet met in Kirkwall recently. So we recognise that grid capacity in Orkney and the moratorium on new connections recently announced by the network operator is a cause for concern. Now, I raised the issue of island connections with the Secretary of State this week in a meeting in London, and put together the proposal. This was on the precise issue of connection charges, which, as Ian MacArthur well knows, is directly related to this issue. The idea of a working group between the Scottish Government, the UK Government and the island councils, and of course in consultation with the network operators, to see if we can get a resolution to this issue, both in terms of the current grid capacity, but also in terms of the future charging to allow that renewables potential to be unleashed from the Northern Islands. The Secretary of State was very interested in that suggestion. I hope it can be taken forward, because it's in the interest, certainly, of the Northern Isles, but in the interests of all of Scotland, that our island community's economic potential contributes to the whole Scottish nation.
David Stewart.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister will be well aware of the severe fuel crisis in the Western Isles, where garages are running out of petrol and diesel and motorists are forced to sell rationing at the pumps. This, of course, has severe consequences for emergency vehicles and the public they serve. Will the First Minister agree to urgently meet Scottish Fuels to help find a solution for the Western Isles?
First Minister.
Yeah, Mr Swinney has been in touch with Scottish Fuels, but yes, I agree to that meeting. I know this is to do with the tanks in South Uist and the work that needs to be done to address that situation. So we'll agree to the meeting, we'll continue to pursue that and hopefully can find a solution.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that May Gurney, which is a major employer in Falkirk as well as in Dundee and Aberdeenshire, has announced that up to 250 jobs are at risk as a result of a reduction in work received from one of its major clients. With the company pledging to work with employee representatives and its other clients in an attempt to minimise the number of job losses, can I ask that the First Minister ensures the Scottish Government offers whatever support it can to give May Gurney and its employees support at what is understandably a very difficult time for them?
First Minister.
Well, I share the member's concern in respect of the announcement made yesterday by May Gurney regarding Scotia Gas Networks, that's SGN, and this is to do with the amount of contracted work from the regulator to reinforce the gas network in Scotland. I'm deeply concerned about the reduction in that contracted work from the regulator, but obviously very concerned at the impact that can have on employees, their families and the surrounding areas of the north east of Scotland, Dundee and Falkirk. I spoke yesterday with the Managing Director, that's Michael Thompson of May Gurney, and immediately offered support through our Partnership Action for Continuing Employment. That's the PACE programme initiative for those employees who may be affected by redundancy. I also think it's possible because there are key skills involved in terms of the reinforcement of the gas network, which are certainly transferable to a number of other industries, including water and electricity. And I've undertaken to be personally involved in seeing the maximum amount of transfer take place to mitigate the number of job losses in Falkirk, Dundee and indeed the North East of Scotland.
Question number 3, Annabel Goldie.
To ask the First Minister what safeguards exist to protect taxpayers against the improper use of public funds by government agencies.
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government is committed to the highest standards of accountability across the public sector, as evidenced by 6 consecutive years of unqualified audit opinions from the Auditor General for Scotland on the Scottish Government's consolidated accounts.
Annabel Goldie.
Well, Presiding Officer, Scottish Enterprise has been demonstrating its own imaginative approach to stimulating economic growth in Scotland and protecting the taxpayer, with junior employees withdrawing thousands of pounds in the organisation's corporate credit cards for personal use. And how some businesses would love that kind of flexible friend. Now, if this is the experience of Scotland's Enterprise Agency, heaven knows what may be going on elsewhere in the public sector. So will the First Minister instruct an urgent investigation into the use of corporate credit cards by his government agencies to ensure that more robust safeguards for the protection of the taxpayer are applied across the board?
First Minister.
Well, I mean, can we just remember that Audit Scotland, in terms of the national fraud initiatives, contrasted the high level of commitment to NFI in Scotland, contrasting with the level of compliance from the UK Government. And particularly on SSE, on Scottish Enterprise rather, internal audit did identify some non-compliance issues in relation to the personal use of corporate credit cards. But given the requirement to settle the bill personally, Scottish Enterprise suffered no financial loss as a result. They have increased the frequency of the review processes to ensure that any future non-compliance is highlighted and addressed quickly. It's not quite the dramatic situation that Annabel Goldie suggested in her question.
Question number 4, Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will consider establishing a national tennis centre.
First Minister.
Well, I was delighted to meet both Andy and Judy Murray yesterday, last Sunday. It's clear that both are passionate about developing tennis in Scotland. To ensure that youngsters have greater access to facilities and coaching, they need to make the most of their talent and potential. We had a positive discussion about their idea for a tennis academy, as well as improving existing facilities and indeed the overall interest in tennis, all of which is certainly in line with the Scottish Government's ambition to increase young Scots' participation in sport. We will be exploring this with the Murrays and their team over the next 2 months, and we hope to make an announcement in this regard in the near future.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. Will he take this opportunity to congratulate Craiglockhart Tennis Centre in my constituency, which has the largest junior tennis participation programme in the whole of the UK? And can he assure me that the Scottish Government is doing all that it can to provide facilities for tennis and grassroots sport for all ages and all abilities across the whole of Scotland, ensuring a lasting legacy from the Commonwealth Games in 2014?
First Minister.
Yes, he's quite right to draw attention to the successes that have taken place in tennis. There's a whole range of figures in terms of participation, number of coaches, which tell us that tennis, I think for understandable reasons, is very much on the up in Scotland. I can give the member that assurance, but I think we should also reflect in terms of the wider range of facilities in sport. The substantial contributions to the Sir Chris Hoy Velodrome Indoor Sports Arena in Glasgow, the £55 million investment towards world-class facilities in the Aberdeen Sports Village, the Tory Glen Sports Complex, and of course here in Edinburgh the refurbished Commonwealth Pool, all of which will be added to both by the additional facilities being built for the Commonwealth Games, and I think in particular the £25 million committed to Scotland's first ever national performance for sport, which will have a football academy at its heart. Now, all these initiatives bode well for the future, both of participation and excellence of sport in Scotland.
John Pentland.
First Minister, North Lanarkshire Council, one of Scotland's leading local authorities, have announced that 1,300 job losses, many of them in my Motherwell and Wishaw constituency.
I'm sorry, Mr Pentland, that's not the question. We're talking about a tennis centre. Could you resume your seat? We move to question number 5, Richard Simpson.
To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government supports the Royal College of Nursing's This Is Nursing campaign, celebrating the professionalism and compassion of nursing staff.
Minister.
Well, Scotland's nurses and other National Health Service staff do extraordinary work day after day and deserve our wholehearted and united support. So I'm pleased to put on record my personal support, the support of the Government, I think the support of the Parliament for the Royal College of Nursing's This Is Nursing campaign, which, as the member rightly says, celebrates both the professionalism and the compassion of nursing staff.
Presiding Officer, I'm sure the whole Parliament would wish to join the First Minister in praising our hard-working nursing staff. But can I ask the First Minister if he agrees with his backbenchers when they said yesterday that the Royal College of Nursing were wrong in stating that the nursing staff numbers are now at their lowest since 2005? And is the First Minister asking the public to believe that axing 2,500 nursing posts is having no direct effect upon our nurses' ability to deliver the quality of patient care to which they aspire and which the RCN campaign celebrates?
First Minister.
Well, that's not what the backbenchers said, as Richard. Well, what they said was there are more qualified nurses and midwives per 1,000 population in Scotland than the rest of the UK. The figures are 7.9 nurses and midwives compared to 5.9 in England, 7.2 in Wales and 7.6 in Northern Ireland. There are currently more nurses and midwives in post than 9 or 10 years when Labour was in government in Scotland in the great boom years for public spending. And now we've had the detail last week on the National Health Service staffing in Scotland. I do hope that the Labour leader will draw her constant and inaccurate remarks there are less staff employed in the National Health Service than when the SNP took office. It's clear from the statistics last week there are more people employed in our National Health Service than when the SNP took office, and that is clear from the statistics. And I know that Joanne Lamont and Richard Simpson will be anxious to correct the record at the earliest possible opportunity.
Nanette Milne.
To follow on from Richard Simpson's point, could I ask the First Minister what his reaction is to the experience of members of this Parliament, including myself, stated yesterday of a level of nursing staff on duty at night in hospital wards which falls short of patients' needs and expectations and leads to unnecessary pressure on frontline staff?
First Minister.
Well, there are obviously, in times of extraordinary economic stringency, despite the determination of this government and achievement in protecting the revenue budget of the National Health Service in real terms, something that hasn't been done by some other administrations in these islands, and people would doubt very considerably if a Conservative administration would have managed such an achievement, that obviously our National Health Service is still under pressure, and that is most certainly the case. All the more so then we should celebrate the record achievements under the range of indicators that show our National Health Service staff, our nurses, our doctors, the whole range of staff throughout the National Health Service are performing exceptionally for this country in difficult times.
Question number 6, Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on the study published by the New Economics Foundation relating to a halt to mackerel fishing. First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government agrees with the report that fishing at sustainable levels would result in increased profit for the industry. This is why we're working with fishermen and moving towards fishing at maximum sustainable yield. It has to be said the benefits of a transitional approach that we're working on in partnership with fishermen are that skills or fishermen market capacity are not lost, key factors not considered in this report. I think in terms of mackerel and sustainability, then this entire chamber should unite in congratulating Scottish and indeed Norwegian fishermen over a period of many years of fishing this stock sustainably and ensure and unite in our demand to ensure that the European Union come to an agreement with Iceland and Faroes on the current totally unsatisfactory position of overfishing by these communities, and that is why there has to be a resolution of that crisis and to implement sanctions as soon as possible.
Mark MacDonald.
Thank the First Minister for his answer. This report has caused considerable concern in North East communities where mackerel fishing is a key part of the industry. Can the First Minister advise what the Scottish Government is doing to influence UK Government and others to ensure some of the more extreme approaches outlined in the report do not gain traction elsewhere and are not pursued? And does he agree that it would be easier to advocate on behalf of the Scottish fishing industry if we had a seat at the top table as an independent Scotland at the heart of Europe?
First Minister.
Well, Richard Lochhead has been doing an extraordinarily good job in making the case for Scottish fishing communities. Of course, it would be much easier to do that job if he wasn't prevented from speaking at some of the European Council meetings, as indeed has been the case. And given that Scotland holds 3/4 3/4 of the UK share of mackerel quota, it seems illogical that ministers responsible to this Parliament do not have a full seat at the Council making decisions on the future of that industry. And surely it is self-evident that a Scottish minister responsible to this Parliament, representing and answerable to the fishing communities of Scotland, would be able to make that case as a member of the European Union.
Very briefly, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This report has been rightly slammed by fishing organisations, but on the issue of mackerel stocks, can the First Minister update us on what the Scottish Government is doing to ensure a continued supply of mackerel is available to supermarkets and other outlets, and can he confirm if the meeting with the supermarkets promised by his Cabinet Secretary has now taken place?
First Minister.
Well, I'll have Richard Lochhead respond directly to the member and update. He makes many meetings with supermarkets to enormous success for Scottish food and drink over the last years. But can I say, Claudia Beamish, the key issue in terms of mackerel stock is to resolve the situation with Faroes and Iceland. That is the key issue. This is a stock being fished sustainably over many years, one of the most profitable stocks in Scotland, available to our fishing communities and therefore to our supermarkets. And we absolutely must get a resolution of the overfishing taking place out with the boundaries of international law by Iceland and the Faroes at the present moment. That is why Richard Lochhead has been pushing so strongly to get the action by the European Union, and that action and the compliance with the international regulation are the only way that we can ensure sustainable supplies for our fishermen to catch and for our consumers to eat.
That ends First Minister's questions. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber.